To those who just joined us, I'm Ashley Dare from Virginia Tech. We're going to get started in just 1 minute here. All right, well, my clock says 3 minutes after the top of the hour. So I think, Elizabeth, you're going to kick us off. So why don't you go ahead and do so?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Maybe. For those of you who I haven't met, I work in Division of Fish and Wildlife. Before we begin thinking about the data, I want you to kind of think about who wildlife viewers are. And I'm sure that you have a couple of people or more in mind. When I think about wildlife viewers, specific people or faces, I think of the people who show up to our public lands. I think about the people who tell us stories about the wildlife that visit their backyards. Wildlife viewers are the people that contribute to our non-game wildlife fund. They're the people who are very likely to be our master naturalists in the state. And our wildlife viewers are enthusiastic attendants at our interpretive programs. These folks are also anglers, hikers, campers, birders, hunters, paddlers, and more. And we know their numbers are growing. So when we were presented with the opportunity to obtain Indiana-specific data on this growing audience, we knew this information would not just serve us in the Division of Fish and Wildlife, but would be a service to the entire Department of Natural Resources. So before I hand it over, I want to be sure to acknowledge Colleen Hartel's work on this project. I want to thank the Division of Fish and Wildlife Executive Leadership Team for valuing this opportunity enough to fund it, and gratefully acknowledge the very, very hard work of Emily, Christy, under the direction of Dr. Ashley Dare. So that's all I wanted to say. I want to be sure there's lots of time for this presentation and invite you to take it away, Ashley.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. And I loved the imagery of your initial introduction there. And many of the insights that Elizabeth has about who makes up your wildlife viewers are ones that we're going to be able to build on here today. So without further ado, I want to go forward and give a bit of a background to the study. And then I'm going to be co-presenting with Christy Patotsky, who is the or the lead author on this report. And she's going to be sharing the stage with me here today. So first, thank you all for being here. Thanks for your interest in the findings from this report. I understand that we have some groups of people watching as well as individuals, and I hope that not only will this be useful to you in your own individual job, but that will also spark conversations and allow you to think about ways that you might work with others in your agency or other partner organizations as well, based on the things that you learn from our study. So as I mentioned, Christy is the lead author on the report that we're talking about here today, and you can see the screen capture of the front page of that report. Also, you can access a copy of the report by holding up your phone and doing a screen capture or a photo of the report QR code, or we've also put that link in the chat pod. Additionally, it was sent out with one of the notifications about this presentation. So It's the same version of the report. You need to start reading it here during the presentation, but I want to make sure that you're all aware that this report is a resource for you, because there's no way in an hour that we can cover everything that's in there. There's a lot more detail than what we're going to be able to go through today. And there's also extensive tables in the back where you can look at the really nitty-gritties and specific numbers of the various findings that we've called out. So as I said, my name is Ashley Dare. I'm an associate professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation. I am a conservation social scientist. So this is my field, studying people and how their lives relate to conservation. And in addition, a lot of my work relates to wildlife viewers. I'm joined on this project by Christy Patatsky, a PhD student who joined us this past year at Virginia Tech. And then also Emily Sinkular is a co-author of this report, and she's the lead author on the regional and national level results of this study and some of the other state reports too. So we did want to point out that if you're interested in looking at regional or national level data that's similar to what you're going to see here specific to your state, there is a report available for that as well. All right, so let's talk about what we're hoping to cover here today. As I said, in line with that profile of a wildlife viewer in Indiana that Elizabeth shared you with in the beginning, we're going to add to that with survey findings and give you some numbers behind what % of people have various characteristics who are wildlife viewers in Indiana. And we are going to focus on 3 things based upon that. One is, how can members of your agency, staff of your agency, support wildlife viewers based upon what we've learned about wildlife viewers through this study? How can you broaden the relevance to wildlife viewers who do not hunt and fish? So we assume that your agency works really closely with the hunting and angling community, like most state fish and wildlife agencies do. And many of those hunters and anglers are wildlife viewers. So in a sense, you are supporting and serving a lot of wildlife viewers, but it's more likely that wildlife viewers who do not hunt and fish do not have as close a relationship with your agency. And you're going to see data that supports that as well. So we hope to be able to give you lots of things to build upon in terms of thinking about what you can do to broaden your relevance to that audience. And then we also will share some insights on how you can develop financial support opportunities for wildlife viewers that are particularly of interest to them. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit of a background about the survey. Elizabeth already shared some of this from her perspective as well. First, we're talking about wildlife viewing throughout this presentation, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page with what we mean by that. And we built upon the definition that is used for the National Survey of Hunting, Fishing, and Wildlife-Related Recreation. And that definition refers to wildlife viewers as those who observe, feed, photograph wildlife, or who visit parks or natural areas to do those same things, or people who maintain plantings and natural areas for the benefit of wildlife. So all of those things come together as wildlife viewers. And I will be splitting out results later to tell you a little bit more about how many viewers you have that fall into each of those categories. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, a large portion of the population in the US and in Indiana specifically view wildlife. So a quarter of the adult population in Indiana are wildlife viewers. And in terms of trends in wildlife viewing, if we look at this nationally, we can see that number is rising in the US. And specifically within the last 5 years of the national survey, they found that 14.3 million additional viewers were reporting viewing, and that was increasing the national participation rate to 34% of the overall population in the US. So a bit more than what you're seeing in Indiana. And this increase is primarily coming from a rise in around the home viewing. So a lot of interest from people in viewing when they can just do it out their window, or they can do it in their own yards or from their apartment porches. And at the same time, hunting rates are declining or remaining stable at the same period. So I'm sure these dynamics are well known to you who work in fish and wildlife agencies. And so while there's a desire to continue to recruit, retain, reactivate hunters, there's also a desire amongst a lot of agencies to think about the potential to build your relevance to this larger group of the public who are wildlife viewers who may not be hunting or angling already and having that connection with their agency. So as we talk to state fish and wildlife agency staff who were involved in our broader national and regional survey effort that was funded by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they talked about several ways that they thought that this was really important to them. One was those trends that I'm talking about. The other was it can be really difficult for agencies to figure out the best way to reach viewers. You have a great database of hunters and anglers. In some states, they also have databases for folks who have their boats registered, or for folks who've bought a wildlife management area permit, or for folks who maybe go to a state park, but there's not a specific place that people sign up and say, I'm a wildlife viewer, so that agencies can reach out to them. Also, there's just a lack of information on viewers' thoughts, preferences, and behaviors. The National Survey of Hunting, Fishing, and Wildlife-Related Recreation has been super helpful to state agencies for understanding things like the amount of funding provided to states from viewers or just general patterns of participation in viewing, but it hasn't been able to dig in as much to things like how specialized or how skilled are viewers, or what do viewers think about agencies? And then agencies are also really interested in how can they better serve and communicate with viewers and other underserved groups or marginalized groups who may be interested in viewing much more than they're interested in hunting and angling. And then also thinking about how to connect viewers to mechanisms to contribute financially. Again, while we have really clear mechanisms for state fish and wildlife agencies to gain support from those who hunt, who fish, who are involved in shooting, there isn't a clear mechanism in many states for contributions from viewers. So a lot of agencies were interested in how can they build those connections as well with their viewing community. So we started off our national and regional project with a literature review, and that literature review goes into a lot more detail on the insights that we've gained from other studies about viewers. And I encourage you to check out that literature review. Again, you can either use the QR code or the link that Emily just put into the chat pod. And the nice thing about this literature review is that Emily and then Kelsey, another one of the graduate students who's worked on this project, did the hard work for you of finding all the studies that have been conducted related to wildlife viewing and then pulling out the key findings. And they did so under really easy to use headings. And so we hope that that can be a resource for you too, if you're interested in knowing not only what did we find in our study related to Indiana or our study related to the region, but what else has been found related to wildlife viewers. So definitely check that out as well. All right, so I'm going to turn things over to my co-presenter, Christy here, who's going to share information about the methods.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christy Patotsky, a PhD student in the Dayer Lab, and I research wildlife viewing as well as bird feeding. So this type of wildlife viewing stuff was really close to home to me. And I'm going to take us into some of the survey methodology that we used. So in terms of the survey instrument, it was applied across 15 additional states in addition to our regional survey with a goal of reaching 1,000 respondents in each state. And we reached that goal in Indiana with 1,005 respondents. And it was administered fully online through Qualtrics, a panel survey company who provides a small financial compensation to survey respondents with the completion of their survey. The survey ran from October to December 2021 and consisted of 117 survey questions. And these covered a range of topics and were then specifically adapted to Indiana DNR where it was applicable. And the first question following the consent question was our screening question, which read, in which, if any, of the following forms of wildlife viewing have you participated in the past 5 years? And then a list of 7 different forms of wildlife viewing, from feeding wild birds to photography to closely observing wildlife, were listed. And if wildlife viewers responded that they had not, or respondents had responded that they had not participated in any of those forms of wildlife viewing, they were then removed from our survey. And I think it's really important to emphasize this so it's clear that our survey results cover wildlife viewers and not those who do not participate in wildlife viewing in Indiana. So the survey questions, there are 117 of topics, including wildlife viewers' demographic characteristics, their viewing behaviors and interests, the duration, location, and frequency of participation, their participation in other outdoor recreation, such as hunting and fishing, but also things like camping and hiking, their level of specialization in wildlife viewing, their viewing related expenditures, their barriers and social support in their participation, and their likelihood of participating in conservation behaviors like cleaning up trash and litter. In addition, we also looked at their familiarity with, perceptions of, and trust in Indiana DNR, their experience with Indiana DNR programs and services, and their past financial contributions to Indiana DNR. And both of those sets of questions were then specifically tailored to what is currently available from Indiana DNR, as well as their likelihood to support Indiana DNR financially and through conservation behaviors in the future. And finally, we also looked at their preferred forms of viewing support from Indiana DNR and the types of communication methods they preferred. We used a number of data quality measures to maximize the quality of our data, and these included attention checks as well as a minimum completion time. So these attention checks, they included statements in our survey questions throughout the survey that were sort of opposed to each other. So for example, they might click, I strongly agree with wildlife viewing is an essential part of my life. And if they also clicked, I strongly agree with wildlife viewing is not an important part of my life, we're sort of alerted to the fact that they might not be paying attention to the survey or they're speeding through the survey. So if respondents hit 2 of those attention checks and failed them, they were then removed from our data set. In addition, if they were speeding through the survey and exceeding our minimum completion time, which is based on trial runs of the survey, they were also removed from the data set. So for our data analysis, we use descriptive statistics for our statewide results, but we also use chi-square tests and t-tests to explore differences among our consumptive and non-consumptive wildlife viewers. And I'll get into what that means in a second. But first, I want to highlight that the data set is now openly available for Indiana for further analysis by the public and by the agency. So here we can now have a link to the data set, which is through Figshare. And I just want to go through a couple of things that are included in the data set. So first, there's a PDF of the survey itself. So you can go through the questions and see the specific wording of all the questions so you understand the data and you sort of have an idea of what you might want to look at, as well as 2 different forms of the survey data set itself as a CSV file for those who use R or Excel to analyze data, and an SAV file for those who use SPSS, the statistical package for social science, which is what we use to analyze our data. And finally, there's an Excel file with a variable guide that goes through each of the variable names and all of the values of each variable, so you know what you're looking at. So back to the consumptive and non-consumptive viewers, for those who aren't familiar with those terms. They are sort of traditional in the study of hunting and fishing and outdoor recreation in classifying folks who participate in outdoor recreation as non-consumptive or those who do not hunt, fish, or trap, but we only looked at hunting, and consumptive wildlife viewers. And we defined those as people who have hunted or fished in the past 5 years. So the sample in Indiana was about 50-50 roughly of non-consumptive wildlife viewers and consumptive wildlife viewers. And to take a closer look at those consumptive viewers, in Indiana, 31% of wildlife viewers only fished and viewed wildlife, 3% only hunted and viewed wildlife, and 15% fish, hunt, and view wildlife. So fishing was a lot more popular, but there still was a number of people who participate in hunting and wildlife viewing. And we, in addition to those data quality checks that I mentioned earlier, we also used demographic quotas to sort of avoid sampling error because we wanted a representative sample of wildlife viewers in Indiana. So we used the data from the 2016 national survey that Ashley mentioned earlier to sort of define categories of who the average wildlife viewer is in the US. And then we used quotas to achieve those values for age, gender, and education. And we did achieve those quotas in Indiana. So the mean age of our wildlife viewers was 49. 50% of wildlife viewers in Indiana were women, 49% were men, and 1% were non-binary or self-described their gender identity. And 26% had 4 or more years of higher education. And now I'm going to take us into some of our starter results for the wildlife viewing survey. In terms of ethno-racial identity, 82% of wildlife viewers in Indiana indicated that they were white. And this is the group that responded that they were only white. And 18% identified as BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, or people of color. But also we provided options and they could select one or more. And so 87% indicated that they were white, 8% Black, 7% Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish, 2% Asian, 2% Indigenous, and 1% other. In terms of household income, over half of your respondents reported a total household income of $50,000 or less, while 15% reported a total household income of $100,000 or more. And now we're going to start to see some of the graphs that we produced in our report. In terms of residential location, it was pretty evenly spread across urban areas, small city, small town, and rural areas. And here you can see we use green to indicate the consumptive viewers, so those who hunt and fish and view wildlife, and purple is of those who do not hunt and fish in the past 5 years. So you can see here that there was no statistically significant difference in terms of their self-reported residential location for consumptive viewers and non-consumptive viewers. And now we can get back to those forms of wildlife viewing that I mentioned in our screening question. So you can see that visiting parks and natural areas to view wildlife was the most popular activity, with over 50% of wildlife viewers participating in that, as well as feeding wild birds with over 50% as well. And here's where we started to see some of our differences between consumptive and non-consumptive viewers. So for the majority of activities, a higher percentage of consumptive viewers participated in all of the activities. So they could select more than one, of course. You can see that not all of them are statistically significant. Well, they all are except for feeding wild birds. And so now I'm going to hand it back over to Ashley to go into some more of the deeper insights from the wildlife viewer survey.
Yeah, thanks so much, Christy. So you now have a sense of some of these profile characteristics of wildlife viewers. And what we've done for the next portion of our presentation is we've organized it by 5 key things that we really hope that you're going to take away from this presentation as you think about what does this mean for your state, or what does it mean for you in your job. So for each of these key insights that I focus on, you're going to see the data behind that recommendation or that insight. All right, so the 5, it looks like we've got a numbering issue going on here, but the 5 key insights are: first, there really is evidence that there's interest in the agency providing more wildlife viewing information and access for viewers. There's also really strong evidence to support the need for more around the home viewing opportunities, and then also building social support networks for wildlife viewers. And then in addition, there's also potential for broadening relevance to viewers who do not hunt or fish, and then also developing financial contribution opportunities for wildlife viewers. So let's start off with this first one here. So in thinking about providing information or access, we gave our survey respondents a whole array of options for how the Indiana DNR could better support their wildlife viewing activities. And the top ones that you see listed here are mostly related to information, right? So you can see they're interested in more information about where to go, more information about wildlife in Indiana, more information about where and when to view wildlife, where there's no hunting, and more information about how to view various types of wildlife. And anywhere from 50% to a third of the survey respondents who are wildlife viewers had these interests in mind. And then additionally, 40% of them said that they were interested in access to more places to go wildlife viewing. So these are what they're really calling for as the things that they'd most like to see coming from the agency. Now, it may be that some of those things are already available to viewers and they're not aware of where they go for them. It can also be that you have some of that information developed on your website, or you have it in other places, but you could make it even more accessible on your website. So for example, we've got a screenshot here of your website, and you can see it lists off all the different things that people can do and places where they could go. But it could be even clearer on here where they can go to view, or also things to do could list viewing and provide more information there as well. So I think that's a clear place where you could implement this sort of recommendation based upon the interest of your viewers. Another really important thing to keep in mind is how experienced viewers are within your state. I think it's really common for state fish and wildlife agencies to have a relationship with birding clubs in their state or Audubon chapters. And within those clubs, you are often really connected to people who are expert or advanced birders, or maybe even intermediate birders. And so that's who we think about when we think about wildlife viewers, are these intermediate, advanced, or expert birders. But in reality, viewing is much broader than that. As you saw from Christy, there's a whole array of ways in which people view. And then what I want to point out here is that the skill level that people perceive that they have themselves is really largely beginner or novice, and also intermediate too. So we can say that about 70% of your state's viewers identify as being beginner or novice. And there is some difference here that I want to point out between the consumptive and non-consumptive viewers. Those folks who are consumptive viewers, you can see, are falling a bit more into that intermediate category instead of into that beginner and novice category. Then we also ask people, how do they want to receive information from Indiana DNR related to wildlife viewing? And the top three responses, again, we gave them a whole array of options that they could choose from, were printed materials, the DNR website, and email updates. So probably some of the traditional ways that you know how to connect with viewers. I do want to point out that you could take a look at the responses within your survey report. And there are a lot of other options that we gave people as well that still do have some interest too. And it may be that certain segments or certain age groups of viewers have different interests within there. But if you're trying to just broadly reach viewers, these are the top responses. And then when it comes to this improving access side of things, of course, you all do have an Indiana birding trail, you have nature preserves, you have fish and wildlife areas. So the question is, are people actually unaware of this, or are they aware of it and still wanting more access? And we don't have those insights from our survey. But I do recommend, and I do think it's an important thing to think about, is how can you first address the issue of making sure people are aware that those options do exist for them for wildlife viewing. And that's certainly a less expensive approach than trying to create more places for people to access wildlife viewing. But you may decide to simultaneously do that, especially if you realize that your locations for wildlife viewing may be primarily away from urban areas, which we saw is where most of your state viewers are located. Do also want to point out that over half of your viewers say that they've participated in viewing on state managed lands, like state parks, or potentially your areas as well. We did not ask people to differentiate between those, since we're pretty aware that people often are not sure which type of state land they're actually on. But those could be places for focusing on additional infrastructure, especially since they're those that tie most closely to your agency and are ones that you have the ability to influence more. And then as you think about barriers that you might be able to address for people's participation in wildlife viewing, again, we gave people a long list of options that they could say they experience as a barrier to their viewing. And they're saying that they were limited somewhat, quite a bit, or a great deal by the distance to viewing locations, a lack of free time, and financial costs. So this gets back to the question of where do you support people in viewing? Of course, it's going to be challenging for you to help people address the issue that they don't have a lot of free time, or that financially it's challenging for them to go viewing. But given that, you can think about opportunities to support them in viewing close to their homes, whether that be at their home, whether that be through remote viewing opportunities like webcams, or building viewing opportunities close to the places where most of your population lives. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Christy, which is a good segue to the topic she's going to be talking about.
Yes, definitely our second insight that agencies should be promoting around the home viewing opportunities. That's seen across our data. And it's definitely somewhere that DNR needs to put its focus on. It's definitely a way to reach the greatest number of wildlife viewers. And if we go to the next slide, we can see the locations in which wildlife viewers participated in Indiana. And as we mentioned before, 61% participated on state managed lands like state parks and fish and wildlife areas, but 76% participate at their own home or property. And you can see, although it wasn't statistically significantly different, it was the only one in which more non-consumptive viewers participated than consumptive viewers. And also 58% participate on locally managed lands like county parks and trails. One opportunity for growth that we like to identify for around the home viewing is looking at maintaining plantings and natural habitat. That was our least popular form of wildlife viewing. I didn't call it out earlier, but that means that there's room for growth, and that might be somewhere that Indiana DNR can step in and fill that role to foster growth in around the home viewing through planting native landscape. And one way that we'd like to frame that is through feeding wild birds and feeding other wildlife. So in addition to having a bird feeder, or in place of having a bird feeder, to provide ways for people to learn about how to plant native landscape in a way that shows them that, oh, this provides food and natural habitat for animals. It could be a really good way to connect with wildlife viewers around their home. Our third insight is that agencies should focus on developing social support networks for wildlife viewers, particularly those who have been historically underserved by wildlife recreation and by state fish and wildlife agencies. And this includes Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Social support sort of defines the entire landscape of how people view wildlife and if they view wildlife. In Indiana, family and friends were the strongest form of social support to wildlife viewers. But one place that we identify room for growth for Indiana DNR to support wildlife viewers is through mentorship opportunities, or to support mentorship opportunities, because this is the least reported form of encouragement for wildlife viewers in their participation. And so through partnering with partner organizations, this could be a role that DNR could fill. And another thing that we looked at in terms of social support networks is looking at accessibility challenges. And we presented the definition produced by Birdability, an organization that focuses on accessibility in birding. And we put this in the survey and asked respondents to indicate the extent of accessibility challenges that they experience. And this was defined as the difficulties someone experiences interacting with the physical or social environment when engaging in a meaningful activity such as birding. These may be the result of mobility challenges, blindness or low vision, intellectual or developmental disabilities, including autism, mental illness, being deaf or hard of hearing, or other health concerns. And we found in Indiana that 35% of wildlife viewers experience somewhat, quite a bit, or a great deal of accessibility challenges while wildlife viewing. And Indiana DNR could look for opportunities to connect with local organizations dedicated to supporting people living with disabilities, such as Birdability, to collaborate on developing further wildlife viewing opportunities. And we just want to take this moment to highlight this resource from Birdability, which is a map that's crowdsourced of all the locations for birding and explains the accessibility features of each location. And this map shows those that are currently reported in Indiana, and it allows people with disabilities to look at a site and understand if they want to go to the site before going. And so I believe Emily just popped the link to the Birdability map in the chat. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it back over to Ashley to talk about those wildlife viewers who don't hunt or fish.
All right, so we've explained already what we mean by consumptive versus non-consumptive viewers. Of course, we know there's some challenges with those terms, but it was the best terms that we had to use. So first of all, consumptive and non-consumptive viewers have very different perceptions of and experiences with Indiana DNR. And it boils down to the primary message that for non-consumptive viewers, there really is a need to increase their basic familiarity with Indiana DNR and provide tailored support for that. And we measured this by looking at both an array of questions related to people's reported familiarity with different facets of DNR, as well as their recognition of the logo for DNR. And so you can see here that these numbers show that the consumptive group there in green is reporting higher levels of familiarity, more of the dark color with the agency than the non-consumptive group is for the agency. And this is a statistically significant difference. All right. And then you can see this logo question that I mentioned as well. And again, 90% of consumptive viewers were saying, yes, they've seen this logo before. And 84% of non-consumptive viewers were saying that they'd seen the logo before. It is a statistically significant difference, although you may also say, well, that's pretty positive that we've got such a high percentage of viewers that do have recognition of our logo. And then we looked at what sort of programs or services have folks participated in the past 5 years. We had a list that we tried to maintain similarly across all of the states and throughout the regions that were participating in our survey. So if you're wondering why your specific program's not called out there, that's why. So we tried to make them pretty universal types of programs. And you can see that gaining information about wildlife was what was most commonly accessed by viewers, or visiting nature education or visitor centers or your lands. So that information as an access piece are the key ways that people have related to you. Now, of course, that's still like only a third of the participants in the survey. And down at the bottom is a really key piece that I want to call out. You'll notice that 50% of non-consumptive viewers said that none of these ways were ways in which they've participated in or used programs or services from the agency in the past 5 years, compared to 33% of consumptive viewers. And of course, you can see that some of the other options were at smaller percentages as well. And across the board, we saw this pattern of more access, familiarity, and use from that consumptive group of wildlife viewers. And then in terms of the ways that they've contributed to the agency, we looked at both non-voluntary ways, or ways that are fees or licenses that are required in order to do something, as well as voluntary ways. And those non-voluntary mechanisms tend to be those items that are tied to hunting and fishing, but then also access to your lands. And so you can see, not surprising, that the fishing license was most common. If you'll recall back to when Christy showed us the breakdown of people that we designated as that consumptive wildlife viewer, or people who hunt and or fish and also view wildlife. fishing was the most common overlap with viewing. And so about 70% of people have a DNR fishing license. So a lot of your viewers are also people with a fishing license. And then about 45% of people who have access permit or entrance fee, or I should say 45% of your consumptive viewers in the last year have had one of those access permits or entrance fees. So those were the most common amongst the viewers, followed by the hunting license. Fees for a program or required conservation or habitat stamp were much less. And then looking at those voluntary items are things that are an option for people, ways that they can give money to your agency. We see that the donation of a portion of the state income tax was most common, but only 15%. So, and that's the highest tier. So across the board, if we switch back to the previous one, you can see that the most common was 75% for fishing, and the least common was down at 15%. And here that's where we're starting. So these voluntary mechanisms are being used less across the board, which I'm sure you're aware of. And then likewise, there's not any statistical significant differences except for at this donation of land to DNR through a conservation easement. And we do want to point out through conversations that we've had with Elizabeth, we're aware that this 72 people saying that they've made a conservation easement in the last 5 years to DNR is not likely based upon the number of easements that you actually have. So there's potentially a misunderstanding amongst the respondents as to what this meant when they selected that. Okay, so then thinking about what sort of benefits current constituents who also view wildlife reported. And I think that it's really important for us to think about that viewers, and whether they be consumptive or non-consumptive viewers, do have a place of common ground. And 30% of viewers believe that DNR's level of prioritization of programs and services for wildlife viewing is too low or far too low. And this is actually a higher percentage than what we saw in some of the states. So both these types of viewers are saying, you know, we feel like DNR could do more for programs and services for wildlife viewing. Okay, so let's shift gears here to this final piece of financial contributions. So we shared with you the ways that people are currently engaged in supporting the agency. Now let's think about what they say they might be willing to do in the future. So these percentages are higher, which it's always a question of how much we should go by people's reported intentions to do something in the future. But what I do think is really important to point out is that these percentages are higher on things like fees for a program and land access, more so than they are for fishing licenses. So it really shows that there's potentially a gap between that fee for a program that people are currently paying and what they're willing to do. So if that's not something that you have a lot of options for people out there, it might be something to build and develop, because you may actually have some demand there that you're not actually tapping currently. Similarly, we see a lot of that for these voluntary mechanisms: tangible products, conservation lottery tickets, and direct donations. All of these are quite a bit higher than what we saw on the actual behavior side of things. So potential as well to build opportunities there. And there's some great examples of other states doing that we particularly go into in the regional and national level report that you're welcome to check out. And we describe, for example, how Florida Fish and Wildlife Agency has built a store for their tangible products. One example that we do call out in our national and regional report that I wanted to talk about a little bit here is a membership type program. And engaging non-consumptive viewers in supporting the agency could really require rethinking the current funding model and doing something like a wildlife viewer specific pass or a wildlife viewer specific funding program. And it could help increase your connection with viewers, particularly those non-consumptive viewers, and using the funds specifically for what might be of interest to people, which they've called out as species conservation. And so that's what Virginia DWR has tried to do and had a lot of success in the past few years developing their Restore the Wild program, where people can donate to the agency, get access to their public lands, but also those funds are clearly earmarked for wildlife habitat. I also want to call out there's lots of opportunities for potential future analyses. Elizabeth and our other state reps have pointed out things that could be really useful to them to dig into deeper. You have access to the data set. Hopefully some folks who have those skills are on the line here and can think about ways to look at rural versus urban viewers, income level differences, levels of specialization. And if you recall, the specialization is another term for skill level, age differences, like I mentioned, for example, that you're likely to see some differences in the way folks of different ages want to be reached by the agency. And then those with accessibility challenges. I will call out that currently Emily is doing even more analysis by on the accessibility challenge front. That's part of her thesis, not specific to Indiana, but more broadly with our regional and national data set. But we will have insights to share on that. And then additionally, we will be doing future analysis, again, not specific to your agency, but more broadly, the full data set, including the regional data on the rural and urban side of things. So those are things that we'll be looking into more, but we encourage you to dig in more on what might be of interest to you within your data. So the reason we are going to be able to look at the rural and urban differences is because we have been recommended for another multi-state grant. So this first round for the regional and national study was a multi-state grant through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and AFWA. And we recently put in with the Wildlife Viewing and Nature Tourism Working Group for a phase 2 grant. And the desire of that grant came out of a really productive workshop that we had at the last Wildlife Viewing and Nature Tourism Academy last spring. And at that workshop, the 60-some folks who attended, as well as about 20 more state agency reps for our project who joined via Zoom, talked about what they thought really needed to happen as a result of this survey, but then also really what sort of support they needed in making the results usable and useful to their agencies. And one of the things that they really called out was that there was a need to make sure that agency staff at all different levels and across all the agencies were aware of the findings and really some of the key insights for how important it is for agencies to build a connection with viewers, especially viewers who don't currently hunt or fish and have that connection with the agency. So we're now going to have more support to be presenting at the regional AFWAs in the coming year. And I should say, we hope, of course, we need the final sign off from Fish and Wildlife Service, but we have been recommended from AFWA. We're also in that grant, we have support for building a community of practice within all of the agency staff who are working to further implement survey results. So our vision for that is that we will work with agency staff through monthly meetings where they will get together with other agencies who are also trying to use the results from this survey. So we hope that Indiana will be involved in that. And we look forward to seeing some members of your staff getting involved in that community of practice and using that as a place to gain support from us, but also your peers from other agencies as you think about how to implement results in a concrete project. And then also we're going to be developing a website with even more resources. All of the great materials that we've been able to gain and put online will all be found in that one spot. and also all of the examples that we have, not only in our first regional and national report, but also that are gained through the community of practice working on implementation, so that other states can be inspired by what other agencies are doing, and then also have access to the resources that might help them do similar things without recreating the wheel. I also want to mention that the Human Dimensions Pathways Conference is coming up in May and June of 2023. The Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, Colorado State University, and Virginia Tech are co-hosting that. It will be held at Colorado State Agency. This conference is really tied into the topic that we're talking about here today. It's thinking about how state fish and wildlife agencies can manage in an era of mutualism. If you're not familiar with that topic, it comes out of the work from Colorado State Agencies, or Colorado State University, where they explore people's values or strongly held beliefs related to wildlife. And people who are mutualists are people who tend to think of wildlife as more of an extension of their own community or of people's relationship with them, and they try to coexist in a sustainable and healthy manner with wildlife. And they're less interested in traditional ways of managing wildlife or thinking about how to relate to wildlife, such as hunting and fishing. So as there's growing number of mutualists, there's also growing numbers of wildlife viewers who don't hunt and fish because they tend to be mutualists themselves. So that agency is going to have a lot of content related to wildlife viewing. It's going to have a full day symposium based upon this survey effort. And then additionally, the states who are involved in the community of practice are going to be invited to send one state agency rep, and we will have some financial support for them to attend the conference. Of course, many more than one person from your agency are invited to attend, but that's all that we have the funding available for. So we really do hope that a lot of you will get that on your calendar. It's going to be specifically relevant to state agencies and really relevant to those with an interest in thinking about how to relate to folks who are viewers and others who share this, this way of thinking about wildlife. So with that, I'm going to wrap up here on our presentation. Please do make sure that you've taken away the link or the QR code for the report. There's an extensive executive summary in the beginning, a lot more detail, all the figures that we showed, plus many, many more, and tables of all of the data. And then, as Christy mentioned, the data set is also available to you. And we have plenty of time here now for discussion, conversation, questions, and anything that we don't have time to cover today or that you'd rather ask individually. You can feel free to reach out to Christy or to me or to Elizabeth as well. And we're all happy to answer questions or give you further places that you can look for your answers to our questions. So in terms of fielding questions, please do put them in the chat pod if you have a question. You're also welcome to raise your hand or to just comment in the chat that you have a question, and we can call on people and you can come off of mute and share your video and ask the question too. That's another option. Do also want to point out that in the chat, Emily put a link to a very short evaluation survey. We're trying to get feedback on how these presentations are useful or not to those who attend them. And we're also interested in any ways that you think you might be using the results from this survey. So it's helpful for us in improving our future presentations and also for thinking about the implications of our work. So if you can take the time before you go offline today to fill out that survey, we'd appreciate it a lot. All right, I'm going to stop sharing the screen so you can see us better. And yeah, we're happy to take any questions. Maybe in the meantime, Elizabeth, is there anything that we forgot to cover that you wanted to make sure that we point out here today?
No, that was just a beautifully composed summary. And there, as you said, there's so much more in the report. And I'm just excited to hear what folks are thinking.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. And we appreciate the compliment of a beautiful summary. That's very kind of you. All the credit goes to Christy and Emily for putting together that presentation. Christy also pointed out in the chat, and I think it's an important thing for me to state as well, is that we have recorded this presentation as well as all the others that we've done are available on YouTube. So if you were interested in the regional or national presentation that I mentioned, you can check out that recording too. And then if you want to share the recording from today with anyone else on your staff or any of your partners who you think might be interested, feel free. It's open for anyone who wants to take a look at that. So what did y'all think? If you don't have questions for us, any comments, thoughts, what's the relevance of this to the work that you're doing? We'd love to hear from you. I see someone's gone off of mute. Okay, we have two.
Yeah, so this is Brad Feaster. I got on really late, so I missed probably about 3/4 of this. I have to go back and watch the webinar, but from what I've read on the report, I think there's a lot of useful data there and insights, and I'm looking forward to seeing how we can use it in public lands.
Great. Sounds good, Brad. And definitely glad that you see the relevance to your public lands group. And certainly do reach out or let us know if there's any questions that you have. But I think that you'll see that there's a lot of mention specifically of state managed lands in there. All right, Angie, do you have a question or comment?
I don't have a question. I do have a comment. I will echo what Brad said just about the great information that is in the report, and really encourage staff who haven't had a chance to look at that report to please look at the report. And then I guess I would be interested in having a bigger conversation in how, and not today, it doesn't have to be on this webinar, but kind of how we might as a department and a division kind of tackle some of the information that's in the report, especially with the multi-state conservation grant, with the opportunity of applying for some funding coming up, possibly to help support that work, maybe starting to get our ducks in a row to think about what we might be able to tackle in some of those insights and recommendations, and then maybe getting a team together to work on getting a proposal together when that call comes, because I do believe that multi-state conservation grant included money for states to help implement projects, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't know the specifics of the upcoming multi-state grants, but I think it's a great opportunity. You're right to think about, are there grant proposal opportunities that you all could use to fund things that you could use this as your justification for. So I really do encourage you to do so. Let us know if there's anything you need for that, but hopefully you have what you need in the report. And then if there is a specific project that your team's working on that would be useful for the community of practice to, identify one of the things that you all want to try to implement and try to do in the next year, we'd love to have you involved in that. And there will be funding support, like I said, for someone to represent your state to go to the Pathways Conference too. So glad to hear that you're thinking about ways that you all could have that conversation. Oh, okay. See that Adeline, I'm not sure if I've got your pronunciation correctly, has pointed out in the chat that as they're the social media outreach coordinator at Indiana, and so the information is really useful for them. And Adeline, I will say that there is specific insights on various social media platforms too. If you haven't seen that yet in the report, definitely take a peek at that. And it does look at what % of people were interested in getting information from Facebook, from Twitter, and also from TikTok. So take a look at that. And then, like we said, the data set's there for you. So there's opportunity to dig into that even more if you or someone else in your agency is able to do so. Okay, so I see that Jerry Ann asked a question about, are there details or comments that gave you insight into what types of costs people felt were the barriers, like gear purchases and binoculars, plant purchases, birdseed costs, park insurances, and fees? So that's a great question, because we just broadly gave people the option to say that cost was a concern to them. We don't know for sure. We have not dug into that even more. I do know that agencies have tried to find ways to address these challenges, like having backpacks for people to be able to check out from the local library so that they can use a field guide and use binoculars there. I'll throw it to Emily and Christy too. I see Christy, you're off of the chat. Maybe you have some additional insights to share as well.
Yeah, so we didn't ask specifically about those things as barriers, but we do have information on their wildlife viewing related expenditures. And I think it'd be a good analysis to look at those who said that they did feel that cost was a strong barrier, and then see what they're spending on wildlife viewing and their trip related expenditures. And we also have a question on whether they've purchased, rented, or owned, and that being sort of all lumped together, equipment for wildlife viewing.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we didn't show you those results, but they are in the report, the questions about how much people are spending currently. And you'll see that those numbers are quite low. So again, if we're looking at these general wildlife viewer who's a beginner or novice, they're not putting a lot of money currently into viewing. Any other questions or comments? So I see Alexandra's saying that this is really useful information to their public engagement team, and thanking us for that. So glad to hear that that's the case, Alexandra. I'm so happy to hear that we have folks from all different facets of the agency here. So that's excellent. And then Elizabeth's pointing out that the amount of money that folks were saying that they spend each year, she recalls as being under $100 per year for most people. Anything else? All right, well then I think we'll wrap up. Feel free to reach out to us. Definitely take a look at the support, or at the report, not support. I shouldn't be reading the chat pod while I'm also talking. I'm not very skilled at that. We hope that we'll be able to work with some of you next year as you implement results. And then we look forward to hearing even more results and applications coming out. Emily, can you throw that link to the evaluation survey one more time into the chat so it's right there for people? Again, we're wrapping up a little bit early here, so I'm sure that some of you have set aside the time. It's gonna be bonus time for you, but if you could spend 3 minutes before you move on to your next thing, giving us some feedback, we'd really appreciate that from you. All right, take care.
Thanks, everybody.